Recording in progress. The results I'm going to show you today. So I'm going to show results from publications I've been a part of, and also some review of recent discoveries and new things that can be done with the Gaia data on the topic of star clusters. And the people I've been working with lately are in different institutes, mostly in Europe, but groups in Barcelona, in Padova and Bologna, in Bordeaux in France, in Lisbon, and some transfusion in California. And I will be talking about two main aspects of Gaia science. One would be the cluster census, so how we can identify a list of clusters all over the Milky Way and trace the large-scale structure. And in the second part, I will be talking more specifically on the distribution of young stars that are in the solar neighborhood and what we have learned about those young aggregates. So to begin for the first part of this discussion, I will be talking about the Milky Way as a galaxy. And I don't know exactly who is not a Milky Way astronomer in the audience today, but the Milky Way is our galaxy. We're inside of it. And for this reason, it's actually very difficult to tell its overall structure. You can only see parts of it from the ground. And even if you collect like lots of data and observe it from outer space, you can only get this projected 2D view. You see the Milky Way from inside. So this is, for instance, the very detailed map of the Milky Way, not the map, the very detailed view of the Milky Way that Gaia has made recently. And you can see lots of details of structure, different reddened stars. And here you can see the galactic center, but you cannot tell the overall structure of the Milky Way. You can see it's a flat-ish stripe. And for me, it's a paradox that we don't know the structure of the Milky Way that well. We know it's a spiral galaxy, but we only know that because we have seen other galaxies are shaped like spirals. And we don't even know how many arms the spiral of the Milky Way has. We don't know how tightly wound they are. We don't know the basic angle of those arms. We don't know if it looks more like a cotton ball, like this Milky Way, like on the left, or if it has few arms with a lot of interarm space. And if you have seen images of the Milky Way, like those in maybe publications, in documentaries or somewhere, they're always fake. They're always either simulations or artist views. And we tend to add a lot of details to those artistic representations. And sometimes I think they're misleading because they make us believe we have a very high degree of certainty on what the Milky Way looks like. So what we can see from the inside has to be interpreted so we can actually tell if the Milky Way looks more like the galaxy on the left or more like the galaxy on the right. And for this, we need a very important piece of information is to determine distances to some objects in the Milky Way. And if you can have distances to a lot of tracers, then you can reconstruct the 3D structure of our galaxy. And the topic of my talk today are star clusters, and they have been used as tracers of the structure of the Milky Way for a long time. They have two very interesting properties for the purpose of tracing the Milky Way, is that their distances and their ages can be estimated much more easily than for individual stars. And there are young clusters, old clusters, so they have been witnessing a large fraction of the history of the Milky Way. And so on top of looking very nice and providing very nice pictures to put in your PowerPoints, they are actually very relevant objects when you want to study not just the Milky Way structure, but also the evolution of stars, because they are a group of stars that are bound by gravity. They are so close that they are sort of orbiting each other. And they are this close because they were born together from the same molecular cloud, so they share the same chemical composition. And they share the same age. So some of them are very massive and they evolve quickly, and some of them have lower masses, so their evolution is slower, but they are the same age, and this is very convenient if you want to study the processes of stellar evolution. I think the earliest example, at least that I know of using clusters as tracers of the structure of the Milky Way would be this paper from 1930 by Trampler. And so he was wrong about quite a few things, but it's a very good example of how if you can estimate a distance to every individual cluster, you can put them on a map like a top-down view of the Milky Way. And he thought we were at the center of the Milky Way, which now we know it's not true, but he was still already trying to put a spiral pattern to connect the dots. Now we know we're not at the center of the Milky Way will be somewhere here. But the fact that, so this is from almost 100 years ago, but nowadays star clusters are still relevant, even if we have very precise measurements from amazing instruments like the Gaia satellite. The use of star clusters to study the Milky Way is still very convenient. So nowadays, if you look at the cluster with Gaia, it doesn't look like just a bunch of points on the sky like in these images, but Gaia also provides you with a proper motion that tells you how every star is moving, the apparent motion of the star across the sky. So you can see here, this is the Hyades cluster, and you can identify the members of the cluster, not just because they are close to the center, but also because of how they are moving. They are co-moving, moving in the same direction as the rest. The convenient way to do that is not to look at arrows on a 2D map, but you can put the points directly in proper motion space, and you just select the stars that have similar proper motions. And in this example, if you select the stars, you can see very clearly concentration on the sky, but even stars that are far away from the cluster, you can still see that they're probable members. And if you look at those stars in a color magnitude diagram, you can see this very detailed structure that is due to stars of different masses. And the Gaia photometry is very precise. I think the only instrument that can compare in terms of precision would be the Hubble Space Telescope. And here you don't just have very precise photometry for all your stars, you can also remove all the stars that are not members. So for studies of very specific phases of stellar evolution, or for studies of ages of clusters, this data set is amazing. Until a few years ago, if you saw a color magnitude that was this nice looking in a paper, it was probably synthetic photometry. Now, for many clusters, you can have very, very clean data like this, that's real data observed. And here I'm showing a different example. So it's still the same idea that you can see stars are co-moving, so they're probably part of the same cluster, and you can identify overdensities in proper motion space. The yellow points here are NGC 2509, so it's an NGC cluster, so it means it was in catalogues in the 19th century. This particular one was actually discovered in the late 18th century. And it has been studied, but people didn't always agree on its distance and how large it is. And now with Gaia, we can see there's a second cluster that's almost overlapping that was discovered very recently. It is sparse, so you wouldn't see it as an overdensity of stars on the sky, but you clearly see it as an overdensity of moving stars. And you can immediately have its color magnitude diagram. Just a few years ago, if you wanted to do this, you needed to write a proposal, get telescope time, and spend a night, maybe several nights, gathering data. Now you can do this in just a few minutes. So you have a very clean list of the members in each of those new clusters. And since you have parallaxes are a measurement of how the stars wobble during a year when the Earth goes across the sun. And they're not directly measurements of distances, but they are related to distances. So you can at least say, if a group of stars is behind another one or in front of another one, And you almost have, if the cluster is nearby enough, you can almost have for free an estimate of its distance. So you can see the 3D arrangement of at least different clusters. I'm showing this example because here it's obvious from the Gaia data that the yellow cluster is almost 3 kiloparsec away. But even very recent distance estimates disagreed if it was like 900 parsec from us, or 1.7, or 2 kiloparsec, 3 kiloparsec. And so sometimes to solve an issue, you needed different groups to study the same objects and write different papers. And now you instantly have an answer with Gaia. So you can do decades of work in just a few minutes. And you can also characterize a large number of clusters with the same methods. In a first paper with Gaia DR2, what I was trying to do was just to identify all the known clusters. And just by doing that, we discovered 60 new ones. A bit like this, when people studied this cluster, by random chance, they discovered this one, which was nearby. And there were also papers dedicated to looking for new unknown clusters. I have listed a few here. I'm really impressed. I was really impressed by this one because it was basically a high school project. I think at first they just wanted to make plots of different things and they noticed new clusters. So I think this shows the power of the Gaia data, that anyone can use a different method and still discover new objects and contribute to the characterization of stellar structure in the Milky Way. And something that was surprising for me, it's not a huge result, but for me it was quite nice, is that lots of clusters that are in the catalog are actually not detected with Gaia data, even if they are supposed to be nearby and bright enough. Because objects like this are not actually groups of related stars. If you look at the proper motions of those stars, they're flying in complete different directions. They're not even at the same distance. So that's the example of the immediate strong impact of Gaia on our understanding of the cluster population of the Milky Way. And nowadays, like today, I think the most complete list of clusters you could get from the literature would be those 2,000 clusters we studied in this paper. And this list includes many of the clusters I reported in this slide, plus new discoveries. And very recently, Alfred Castroginard revealed new clusters from the Gaia EDR3 astrometry. And so nowadays, until recently, you would make a paper if you discovered one new cluster. Now people discover 300, 500, 600 clusters in a single paper. And I have also applied a procedure to estimate the ages and get a better distance and estimate of the interstellar extinction for all of these clusters. And again, this is not a revolutionary thing that we can get ages and distances for clusters, but they used to be studied one by one. And now we have hundreds of thousands of clusters in a single sample. So we need to come up with a method that can deal with all of them homogeneously, not one method for the nearby ones and a different method for the old ones. And the road I chose to follow for this task was to use machine learning. I know it's fashionable nowadays, but it's actually very convenient for many automated tasks like this. And what I wanted was a method that can give you the age, the distance, and the reddening. So the 3 basic parameters for clusters. And that was able to deal with very different cases that would work for the very clean color magnitude diagrams of the very young clusters and also the sparse, old, distant clusters. I wanted a method that can deal with stellar contaminants when the membership is not actually perfect, so you have outliers in the color magnitude diagram. Old clusters, sometimes they have those stars called blue stragglers that are bluer and brighter than they should be. These are basically stars that refuse to grow up and they say, no, I want to remain blue. And if you want to fit a line through these points, it's getting difficult because maybe your procedure will try to deal with those. Some clusters have this double sequence, which corresponds to binary stars. And for automated procedure, this is not easy. So very often you can actually get a good result if you manually, by eye, visually fit isochronous models to the observed CMD. It works if you have 5 or 10 clusters, but if you have 3,000, you cannot do that by eye. First, it's harder for someone to reproduce your results, but also it's not practical, and it's probably a very boring task to fit manually an isochron to 2,000 clusters. And what I decided to do here was to not even use models. I would just use a training set of a few hundred clusters that have been characterized in the past. Use these clusters and create some variations and use that to train a neural network, because it teaches the network what real clusters look like. And from this, I would create a 2D histogram of observed clusters and give that to the neural network. I would also, just to guide it, estimate the slope in like some measured quantities from the color magnitude diagram, just to help the network understand if it's maybe a young or an old cluster. Because in young cluster, the blue stars are the brightest, but in older ones, the red stars are the brightest. Some kind of estimate of the average color of those stars, and the Gaia parallax, which is a strong constraint because it tells you if your object is at least very distant or very nearby. So that's a typical architecture for a neural network. It's not the important part, but I think we got pretty good results, for instance, with cases like this, that a human will understand that this is the upper main sequence, this is a red branch, a red giant branch, and these are blue stragglers. But because of differential reddening, this is not a straight line. It's more of a like broadened, elongated distribution. The red giant branch is also not a very clear line like this, but it's more broadened. And the neural network has seen many examples of broadened main sequences, so it understands this works. If you want to fit, you could get more precise results if you had a very complex model, but sometimes it can take hours to get parameters from for a single cluster. And here, once the network is trained, it just takes milliseconds to get an estimate. So I'm not claiming that this procedure is the most precise for everything, but in general, if you want to characterize 200,000-300,000 clusters, I think for the moment, this is the way to go. And now if you have ages and distances for all the clusters, you can put them on a map of the Milky Way. This is kind of messy, but the blue points correspond to the youngest clusters and the yellow points to the older ones. The blue points you can see are not randomly distributed. They follow some overall structure. Here I try to compare it with the model of the spiral arms. The correlation is not that striking. We can see around the Sol neighborhood a large number of young clusters. This structure here that might correspond to what's called the Perseus arm, but it's in 2 fragments. In this figure, I'm focusing on the very youngest ones, so maybe the contrast is better. I'm still showing a model of the spiral arms. And I think here what we can see is, so we cannot see arms that are continuous, and we can also see some spurs between the arms. So there is some structure that seems to be connecting them. So I think this is showing that the spiral pattern, at least in our region of the Milky Way, is not that clear. We don't have clear straight line arms separated by empty interarms regions. And this kind of distribution is actually seen in the distribution of young stars that are also expected to trace the spiral structure. Here, a recent paper using OB stars from the EDR3 catalog. And they also see that the outer arm, so instead of having a Perseus arm that's connected these 2 structures, maybe the pitch angle of these arms is larger. The local arm seems to extend further. And so I think this is showing that we should revise the spiral arm models, at least for the stellar constituents, the young stars, the young clusters and the young OB stars. They're telling us that the spiral pattern is more fragmented than we thought. And this map of the Milky Way on the left, it's an artist's view, but it's used for so many publications. And sometimes people have distance measurements of things, and they use them not just for outreach, but they use this picture for scientific publications. And I think maybe this could be revised, and we probably look in a Milky Way that looks more like those two galaxies on the right, and looks less like the artist's view on the left. Another interesting insight you can get on the structure of the Milky Way, if you have the 3D location of clusters and an estimate of their age, is if you look at the galaxy sort of edge on, you are able to put the clusters in a plot where the y-axis is their distance above or under the galactic plane, and the x-axis is their distance from the galactic plane, from the galactic center. And we can see that in the inner regions, most clusters are young, and I think this is telling us that old clusters cannot survive to old ages in the galactic disk. And on the other hand, in the outer disk, most clusters are old, which is showing that maybe there is not much star formation going on, at least nowadays. And the old clusters that are here at high altitudes have probably migrated from inner regions to the outside. Every cluster that is far above or below the disk is a very old cluster, at least 1 billion years old. And to be more quantitative, if you split the sample in 3 age groups, you can clearly see that the old clusters are overrepresented in the outer disk and underrepresented in the inner disk. But there still are a few old clusters inside. So I'm curious what allows them to survive to old ages. What are important properties they have? Are they more massive? Or maybe they were born in a particular star-forming mechanism. And on the other hand, in the outer disk, what caused these clusters to migrate very far away? Did something specific happen to them, or is this a general property of clusters that during their life, they will move away from the central parts of the disk? We try to be very quantitative and estimate the increase of scale height of the clusters with age. But this is a very complex process, because the scale height of the Milky Way also increases with galactocentric distance. In the outer disk, the scale height is larger because the galactic potential is weaker, there's less mass, so there's more freedom to move up and down. So star formation itself, as you can see, the blue points, the young ones, have a large scale height. So if you want to fit a model, you need to take into account the fact that the scale height changes with galactocentric radius, but the ages also change with galactocentric radius. So there's a high level of degeneracy here when you want to fit parameters. And if you want to allow the migration rate to change with galactocentric radius as well, then this is very degenerate. So what I would like to be able to do here is to fit a relation that shows the heating of the disk with age, not in positional space, but in velocity space. And for this, we would need 3D velocities for all the clusters. We have very good estimates of their proper motions, so 2D velocities, but for the vast majority of clusters, we do not have the radial velocity. We miss the last dimension of the motion. And to get radial velocity, the best way we can do that, even nowadays, is not from Gaia, even if Gaia will provide in the next data release a lot of radial velocities. They won't be very precise. The best you could do is from the ground. And there are two very exciting large-scale surveys that will be based from the ground. One is WEAVE that will be conducted from the Canary Islands, so observing the Northern Hemisphere, and foremost from the Southern Hemisphere. So they are very complementary to each other, and they are able to observe hundreds of stars in a single pointing. And this is ideal for clusters, because nowadays what you do is you get 2 or 3 stars that are, or maybe sometimes 10, that have a very high probability of being cluster members, and you can get high resolution spectroscopy for them. But now with these instruments, you can get hundreds of stars. Even in the outskirts, you can study the individual velocities of stars within each clusters. So I think this, in the next few years, this is not for the next decade, this is for now. And this will be a game changer when you want to understand the overall distribution of all of these stars and how their velocities change with time. And I'm just going to say a word on these 2 particular clusters, because if you look at the distribution, so you can see old objects until maybe 16 kiloparsec from the galactic center, and then nothing for 4 more kiloparsecs. And then, only then, these 2, Berkeley 29 and Sorrow 1, they are very distant, maybe more than 20 kiloparsec from the galactic center, 2 kiloparsecs above the galactic plane. And in their direction, so to explain their location, people have been suggesting that maybe they don't even come from the galactic disk. Maybe they were brought by an accretion event. Maybe they come from outside the Milky Way. And this idea was reinforced by the fact that in this direction, there is the tail of the Sagittarius stream, which is the disruption tail from the Sagittarius dwarf spheroidal galaxy. So it was suggested and maybe sometimes assumed that they come from outside of the disk. But the Gaia probe motion and even the Gaia, and so the Gaia probe motion tells you first that these stars are moving like disk stars. They're not moving like the Sagittarius stream. So they are part of the disk. And since they have been studied with ground-based spectroscopy, we also have radial velocities. So we can integrate their orbits. We have the full information on their 3D position and 3D velocity. And we can see they're not even on very eccentric orbits. And they behave like normal disk stars, disk clusters. So it's very interesting that these 2 objects are not, they don't come from outside the Milky Way. And I'm really interested in knowing if there are other clusters like that to be discovered in these empty regions. Is it empty because we don't know the clusters there, or is it really empty? Like, will the next data releases of Gaia help us find objects here, or is this region really empty? And I think both options are possible. And on the individual evolution of old clusters, something we can start doing now on a large number of objects is that we can see that clusters are not just spherical objects. We can see how they sometimes have elongated morphologies, and we can see stars escaping their host clusters. I really like this study by Johan Tarek from last year, where they were able to characterize the elongated morphology of almost 400 clusters. You cannot do that for the entire 2,000 known clusters, but for the most nearby ones, you can have a very good idea of how their morphology is distributed. And again, until recently, when you said, I'm studying the most nearby clusters, you would mean like 5 or 10. And now when you say just the nearby clusters, it's like 400. So it's much, much larger sample size. And it has been shown that the elongation of those clusters usually follow the direction of the galactic plane. This is a representation from another recent paper. So the horizontal lines show the elongation of those clusters. And this is not a surprising result because the tidal forces are stronger in the Z direction. And this is just showing the normal evolution the dynamical evolution of clusters, but this is the first time we can actually see it for hundreds of clusters. So we can understand them not just as isolated blobs in the Milky Way, but we can see how they are influenced by the Milky Way potential, and we can see the stars leaving the cluster one by one. In some cases, we can see real tidal tails, so we can see stars that are no longer gravitationally bound to the clusters, but they are still traveling with it for at least for a while. And the shape of the tidal tail tells us about the mass content of the cluster and a number of things that you can model. And we know that we can see there's a very good agreement between the observed shape of those tails and what is predicted by models. And I think that will be a very important point now to understand how clusters are disrupted and why some of them survive. Quickly, a very simple example, but that's also a recent paper. Andres Piatti and Piatti Mahan have shown that these two clusters that are completely unrelated, different ages, they come from different places in the Milky Way, they're flying through each other. And they can feel each other's presence, and this is driving their disruption. So they have this elongated shape, and this comes from the fact that crossing each other gives them a shock that will also drive their disruption. So it's the only example that I know of such a situation, but that's showing us that we can see a great detail about the individual stars within each cluster. And to look back to why this is relevant to the Milky Way structure, it's because every time you make a map like this and you want to fit a function of the evolution of something like I showed the scale height with age, or sometimes people want to use clusters to see the evolution of the abundance distribution in the Milky Way through time. So they take a sample of young clusters and old clusters, but in the old cluster sample, you only see those that have survived. Maybe in order to survive, you need to migrate to less busy places in the Milky Way. Or maybe in order to survive, you need to have very specific initial conditions for a cluster. So the old cluster sample is biased. And to understand how it is biased, you need to understand what exactly drives the disruption and what drives the survival of clusters. So that was all for the large-scale structure of the Milky Way. And in the second part of this talk, I will talk about the distribution of young stars in the solar neighborhood and how this has also been completely changed by the way we do things has been completely changed by the availability of Gaia data. And I really like comparing what we do now with older references, and this is from over 100 years ago. And people have been studying the 2D and 3D distribution of massive stars in the solar neighborhood for a long time. Actually, this paper from 1914, they didn't even know that O and B stars, helium stars, they didn't even know that they are young stars. There was actually a theory that maybe stars are formed in a completely random, uniform way, and they converge during their life, so that those OB associations were groups of like cemeteries of dying stars. And so that's quite interesting that they had very nice observational descriptions of OB associations, what we call O and B associations. But their understanding of the processes that drive that were nothing compared to what we have today. And they were still able to, so here this is, they could determine parallaxes to stars and see that they clump in different areas. And they could even produce proper motions. So this is a figure from actual papers. You can see arrows for different groups of stars. You can see some are diverging, converging. And they were making 3D, like top-down view projections of the B stars and O stars in the Milky Way. So in terms of the way we present results, this hasn't changed a lot, but obviously we have much more precise data and a better understanding of the physics of what's going on. And you can contrast this picture I'm showing from 1929 with this recent density distribution map of the O and B stars in the solar neighborhood by Eleonora Lazzari. And the sun would be in the middle, and you can see some prominent features here. This is the Orion complex. This is Scorpius Centaurus, the Vela region, and they contain stars of various ages, but you can see very, very fine structure and very complex like islands and elongated distributions. And I'm going to be showing, I hope it's not too overwhelming, but I just want to show you the variety of maps and 3D projections and stuff people have been doing nowadays. These stars are pretty much the same as those in this map, but trying to separate the different groups based on age and kinematic properties. And in each group, if you zoom in, you can see more substructure. So this entire blue group here, if you look at it, you can still further split it into other groups. And this is fractal and it's endless. And people run out of colors to use in their plots. And I don't mean it as like, it's really impressive. Like in this paper, there's maybe 3 or 4 different kinds of purple dots. And that's showing at some point, there's so much new structure we can see that's even representing it, even showing it, especially in a traditional medium like a journal paper where you need 2D plots. It's very difficult. So people are increasingly using interactive. They add links to their papers so people can play and maybe remove some of the groups. And just identifying and cross-identifying groups between papers is sometimes very difficult. In this study of Canis Major, they really tried to see if each of the groups they saw had already been reported in the past. And it's the thing, especially with the publication rate nowadays, maybe you're publishing a paper and 2 months ago, someone also studied that. And so you need to make sure like cross-matching every piece of fine structure is very difficult. So in a way, the stellar census in the solar neighborhood is harder because of the amount of substructure you can see. On a large scale, we can maybe agree that clusters are general groups, but in the solar neighborhood, it's very, very difficult to name every single thing. And maybe we don't even need to name every single aggregate we see. And those fine detail we can see in the structure, they have taught us something about the origin and the star formation condition of these groups. I will be focusing mostly on this group in the Vela region because it's one I've studied in the past, but similar results have been found in Orion, in Vela, and in other associations. So if you look at this Vela complex from the sun, this is more or less the star distribution you see, so in L and B coordinates. And here I have labeled groups that were known before Gaia. And this region was thought to be home of maybe 5 or 6 clusters and an overall distributed sparse association. If you look at this with Gaia, that's not what you see. You wouldn't say these are 5 clusters and 1 sparse association. You see a lot more substructure than that. You would say maybe 12 or 15 groups, and some are sparse but elongated. And here the color code corresponds to different ages. So for instance, all the green points are the same age. And despite spreading, the green points are distributed over like 100 or 120 parsec. The orange points are very young, 10 million years, and they spread over 80 parsec. So this distribution is too large to be explained by expansion. These stars are very young. They weren't able to travel away from each other like this. And there is a strong level of substructure. Again, for a comparison with what you would do before Gaia, It was actually known that there was some level of substructure here, but for instance, with radial velocities from the Gaia ESA survey, Rob Jeffries and their collaborators, they found that in this region, there's not a single peak of radial velocity, but two shifted peaks, and one is actually wider than the other. So it means there's actually two different groups. And so this has consequences on the level of structure you can find in young aggregates. But my point here is that this, just a few years ago, you could make a paper on the fact that this is not one peak, but two peaks. Nowadays, you find such like seemingly infinite level of substructure everywhere. So that's where we are.
Tristan, 5-minute warning.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
And with Gaia, you don't just see the 2D distribution, but you can also see, at least for things that are nearby enough, you can see there are 3D distribution. So this on the right is not a model, it's the actual density distribution of these stars in 3D. And we can see that this, for example, aggregates of young stars, it's expanding overall, but there's no local strong expansion. So it means these stars, they really formed, the compact groups were compact and the sparse areas were already sparse. It's not the result of expansion. And this is something people have seen in other regions, in Scorpius and Taurus, which has been very studied in the past. In the Orion area, same thing. So I'm going quickly here, but these sparse groups are not the result of quick expansion. Maybe the Lambda Orion cluster, this one, okay, every arrow is pointing outwards, but for the other one, it's more of a complex overall expansion, but not very quickly. And the ability to see this is brought by the fact that with Gaia, you can make a 2D maps of the 2D velocities. If you have radial velocities, you can have precise, sometimes very, very precise radial velocities, but you don't know which star is in front of which one. So you cannot tell if two stars are moving away from each other or towards each other. And the point that has been seen in many, many associations of young stars is that they are expanding, but not that quickly. And this was predicted in some models that say that when you have a collapse of a molecular cloud, sometimes you can form very dense regions that might become clusters, but sometimes stars can form even if there's not much density. So you can get all levels of densities. That's what people refer to as the hierarchical model. And therefore, the sparse areas, they're not dense areas that have expanded. They're just areas that form like that. And that led to this formula in a paper by Jake Ward. It says not all stars forming clusters. And that's something that has made people angry sometimes at conferences. I've seen people strongly disagree with that. But I think the observations, I think the Gaia, the interpretation I would make of the nearby distribution of stars tends to support this kind of scenarios. So to finish, I'm going to summarize the ideas from the two different parts of the talk. The first one is that the spiral pattern in the Milky Way, it's really not obvious, even if you have very precise distances from Gaia and good age estimates, it's still not making the pattern clearer, which I think indicates that the pattern itself is not that well defined. It's probably some kind of flocculent galaxy. Gaia is amazing, but if we have ground-based information to supplement this data, especially the radial velocities and later chemical abundances, then you can unlock a whole new level of science. You can do like 3D integration of orbits. You can do lots of stuff to understand the large-scale structure of the Milky Way. Then there was a traditional distinction between what was called clusters and associations. So clusters was maybe the bound groups and associations, the unbound groups. But now we can see a whole continuum of things like loosely bound and something are compact but very extended. So I don't think there is a reason to use a vocabulary that distinguishes between clusters and associations anymore. But changing the terminology would probably be hard. Maybe it will take many years. And there is this observation that in young associations, even the very young ones, you can find sparse and not sparse and loose and elongated and compact regions of stars that are the same age in the same area. So that favors the hierarchical model of star formation, rather than maybe a more simplistic view that stars form and then gas is expelled and then the cluster expands. So we can see we have all sorts of densities in star forming regions, and a single event of star formation can create stars over hundreds of parsecs. What we saw in those plots here is that stars that are the same age are spreading over 100 parsec. There are even studies showing that this green population extends for another 50 or 80 kiloparsecs all the way to the Orion region. So in one event, you can form stars not just in one cluster, but over a large region. And so that was my scientific summary and a more meta comment, but the field of star clusters has received an enormous boost from the availability of Gaia data. The fact that all sorts of methods can be applied to identify clusters, mining for new clusters, characterizing the known clusters, and the literature, the pace of publication has been really, really high. And very often by the time a paper is published, something in between has been published. And so even keeping your citations up to date is very difficult. We organized a workshop on this topic in the past October, and I was really surprised by the high number of people who registered and actually attended the workshop. The fact that it was entirely online probably helped with the attendance, because we got students, people who don't have travel grants, people who are just interested maybe in 1 or 2 talks and would not travel for a whole workshop. There were students from South America and from Asia. Actually organizing, finding the right time slots to organize that was not that easy, but we made it work. And in the feedback we got, the main thing that people were disappointed with is that there were not enough talks. They wanted the workshop to be longer, which honestly 3 days online stuck on a computer for me is tough, but people want more of that apparently. So I think this is a whole new tool that we have started using more during that pandemic times, but it's something we should even keep doing later, and we should have started doing before, because that's a huge opportunity to get many people involved, and not just the usual people who know each other's faces and each other's work, but really being able to share that and the different approaches. This is also linked to the fact that the Gaia data is public. Anyone can use it, computer scientists, anyone who wants to illustrate something for a lecture, they can use it. And so that's my last conclusion. Lots of new science can be done, a really, really great deal of new results constantly coming in, new ways of presenting the results. And I think this is a real revolution in the Milky Way studies, Milky Way astronomy, and it's not over. So maybe if I give a talk a year from now, there will be a lot of new shiny plus to show. And thank you for listening. I'm finished. Thanks.
Thank you, Tristan, so much for these beautiful results that actually demonstrate how much the state of the art has been revolutionized by Gaia. So I think now it is time for questions. So please raise your hand and I give you the word. So maybe while people warm up, I can shoot a first question, which is about the completeness of the open cluster population, right? So you showed those distributions, those spatial distributions for cluster. So my question for you is, do you think we are complete now? And if so, within which volume?
So one problem with this idea of completeness is that, for example, if those things really have fractal distributions, maybe new searches for clusters can keep finding new substructure that sometimes are just fragments of a structure that was known before. So understanding which objects are really new and which are just more precise characterizations of structures. It's not always easy, but I would say, so that's for the solar neighborhood. Then for the large scale distribution, the fact that every new study finds hundreds of clusters makes me think that we're definitely not complete, but there's a real lack of clusters after 3 or 4 kiloparsecs from the sun. In the inner Milky Way, maybe 3 kiloparsecs from us, and the outer Milky Way, maybe 4. And understanding the completeness is, I think we need more experiments to understand the completeness. We don't know if this empty region is due to observational biases or to actual physical structures in the Milky Way. I would like, so those clusters at the limits, they don't have very high extinctions. So it makes me think that we are not limited by dust extinction in the outer disk. In the inner disk, however, yes, those at the limit have very high extinctions. So I think extinction is the dominant factor here.
Right.
And we also need to, so I think it would be important to have experiments on how the detection schemes work and really understand which are observational biases. The short answer to your question is no, I don't think we're complete.
All right.
The answer is it might depend on the area.
So, and towards the inner galaxy, do you think that the density also plays a role, meaning fewer open clusters would survive?
Yes, I think that's part of it is physical, because we see clusters and there's no reason, if there's an old cluster or a young cluster, we should see it anyway.
All right.
So, old clusters don't really survive, but then there's the problem of extinction plus the dense background. So the contrast is very difficult. Right. And it's a challenge.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Angela, please go on.
Yes, since David already mentioned the completeness of cluster, I would like to understand if you think that the Gaia will be able to find new clusters in the external part of the disk, or if we need to wait for something like LSST or other surveys like that. So is it a problem because of the distance of the crowding? Not, I don't think so. Or is it a real lack of clusters? And can we hope to see something in the next few years? And just since you mentioned your very interesting workshop, I wish to remind people that there will be at the EAS 2022 in Valencia, there will be a Gaia symposium, and that will be very interesting. And there will be a special session dedicated to open clusters and the revolution that has come out from Gaia and from the service.
So I got disconnected for a second, a few seconds, so maybe I missed your question. So I will answer your question about the outer disk clusters. These two clusters, Berkeley 29 and Sora 1, they were discovered, I think, by chance because they stand out or something, but they are clearly visible with Gaia DR3 and EDR3. So if we can see those, but we know they exist, so it's easier to spot them, but if we can see them, then probably if there are others more nearby, we would see them too. So I expect Gaia to help us understand if these are very rare or more common examples. But for the faraway disks, then probably yes, LSST can maybe help us. And for the low galactic altitude clusters, maybe if there's a Gaia in near infrared, that could also help us find the limits of star formation. But I really hope that Gaia can help us understand what's going on in this outer disk region. I really think it can.
Thank you.
And please, Emanuele.
Hi, Tristan. Very nice talk. I have actually two, I hope, quick questions. So the first one is about the Milky Way structure. And so at some point you showed how, based on your open cluster catalog and sample, we probably redesign the spiral arms and most of the at least the close by Milky Way structure. So my question is, how do your results, which are based on cluster, compare with, for example, results by Marina Kunkel, which are mainly based on single field stars? And well, I can ask the second question later, maybe.
So for the comparison here, I'm showing a comparison with OB stars. So these are not cluster stars, and I think there's a general agreement on the overall distribution. And I have seen also, so there have been studies of the local arm that says it's more extended than previously thought, and that it extends in this third quadrants. I have also read papers about the Perseus arm, and people have found that there are projection effects that make it look like it is continuous, but it's actually fragmented, which is also consistent with the OB star distribution. And there's a study of OB stars showing what a feature that's called the Cepheus spur here. So it would be this kind of split of the local arm, which I think is also sort of seen in the distribution of clusters. So there are overall features that you wouldn't say you see if you just had this, but if you compare that, it's very compatible with other structures in infrared using Spitzer data. There's a study showing that the Sagittarius pitch angle is actually larger than in the Reed model, which I think is also what we see here. So clusters alone don't tell you everything, but the compilation of clusters with all the other tracers, I think they paint a compatible with each other, a coherent picture.
Okay, thank you. And so if I can, David, just a quick second question about the cluster expansion. So at some point you mentioned and you showed result about this diffuse structure expansion, and you compare those results with those obtained by Kuhn and collaborator about more cluster-like systems. So my understanding was that most of this expansion was very likely driven by stellar evolution, for example, supernovae explosion or something like that. But maybe I missed something. So I think that you were actually pointing toward a different answer and explanation to the expansion that is observed basically in most of these young system that you showed.
So I think both are possible, but there's one picture that says clusters form very dense, and then massive star evolution like supernovae, like winds, they drive away the gas, and so they make the cluster less gravitationally bound, and so it becomes very supervirial and it expands quickly. And this is, for instance, what maybe we can see in this Lambda Orion cluster. And we know there has been a recent supernova explosion here, but it's not the mechanism that explains the expansion of every star grouping. And in other cases, the grouping is sparse nowadays when we see it because it formed sparse. And the expansion, yes, there is expansion because maybe it's formed slightly supervirial and its gas is being dissipated and there's the tidal forces on the Milky Way, but they act on it more slowly than a violent expulsion of gas. So this picture would be explaining maybe what you were mentioning, but in many cases, the expansion is not as dramatic. And it means this was already sparse at the time of stellar formation.
Okay.
I don't know
Okay.
if that
Thank you.
answers your question.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. So there is time for a last quick question, but I don't see any hand raised. So let's thank again Tristan for his nice presentation. Thank you so much. And we'll see you all on next Thursday.
Thanks for the invitation and see you sometime.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.